All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of GRUKology. I'm Michael Cochran, future church planting minister for Gloucester, and I've got with me my rogues gallery of GRUK: Andy Young, Oxford; Darren Moore, Chelmsford; and Josh Rieger, Hexham. Great to have you guys here.
I love how we're abbreviating all the intros now. No, it used to be Josh Rieger, all his backstory, his relatives, what his favorite food and color was, Darren Moore, how long he'd been growing his beard. Now it's just like Andy Young, Oxford. Love it.
By now it's like, if you don't know us,
yeah,
some blokes, who cares, nobody cares anymore. They just get onto the topic. Either let's listen to it or let's not listen. Anyway, today we're just going to discuss all the ins and outs regarding opening up. We did this earlier during lockdown, which ended up being, I thought it was a great podcast. And now we thought we'd head back to it to start talking about our initial thoughts, if you will, in terms of opening up. So I guess before we get into actually restarting, why don't we just go around and just tell us what you're currently doing right now. You're
and if you're Darren, then what shirt you're currently wearing.
Let's see the shirt, Darren. Come on.
So Darren goes first then.
This is targeted directly at me, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it is, because in a gender confused world, Andy's smooth faced and wears pink quite a lot. I'm just saying. But so this is a bit of there it goes. And so and if you're just on the podcast, you're missing all this. Also a bit of advertising as well.
Oh, I love it. How come you've got that and we don't?
Well, you can. So advert for my sister. I think they're gifts by Zoe, or gifts at Zoe. She makes all this stuff, so she'd make this stuff to order. So
for those go ahead.
Well, Glad's suggestion was, and in fact she made me a coaster as well. Look, and this is all in lieu of Zoom Utopia.
Darren is making fun of Andy for the pink and beardlessness, but he's the one who's accessorizing.
He's got the stash. He's got the stash. This is hilarious.
So Glad's suggestion is the logo here, and on the back the quote from Josiah, my son, after the Zoom Utopia, which is a pretty good job for four dads who don't know what they're doing. So go to our website and buy them now.
Sure. We'll get a link up there, maybe. Anyway, well then, with Darren, you kicked us off with your official GRUK swag and your advocacy for beards and Darth Vader. What's Chelmsford doing during the reopening?
We haven't reopened yet. So over the last few weeks, and for the next few weeks, there's actually some important building work going on. We rent a chapel from the Methodists. And there was some serious damp problems that had to be dealt with, and it's been rendered and it's in limestone, so it has to oxygenize and that sort of thing. And they found some rotten beams as well. So that's all being so at the moment the inside of our area is covered in scaffolding, and we looked at alternative venues, but they weren't forthcoming. It was very difficult for other venues to accommodate us for all kinds of reasons, to do with insurance and internal politics with their organization. So we are meeting on the 26th of July is the earliest time we're going to meet. So
okay,
we're risk assessing tomorrow.
So currently you're just continuing with the online services as you've been doing.
Yeah. So we do we stream online on Facebook and YouTube and Periscope in the morning, and then in the evening we meet in Zoom, but sort of stream about half the service out. It's a bit more informal in the evening what we do.
Okay. Well, and Andy, you're in some of the same boat in terms of you guys rent your facilities. So go ahead. What are you guys doing? Because I think it's relatively the same right now.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. So we've been told by our morning service, where we have a morning service, St. Luke's Chapel, run in the centre of Oxford. We've been told the earliest we'll get in is September. Okay. So there's no leeway on that. And then our evening service, we're hoping that we'll restart probably early August now. Probably 26th of July is a possibility for our evening service, but probably early August. The UK government are trying to bring out apparently some extra guidelines on multi-use sites. So where premises are being used by more than one party, like third, fourth, fifth parties are coming in. They want to bring in some new, they're having I presume they'll have buffers, but a buffer time between one group and another group, and time for cleaning, and they want to bring out some guidelines on that. So our evening service location, which is again Centre of Oxford Friends Meeting House, is waiting for that. So we're continuing online provision in the meantime.
I don't know if this is law. I was reading somewhere that hotels are going to have like 72 hours between uses of a room for deep cleaning and for everything else. I mean, it's apparently just for hotels and stuff, it's really restrictive.
Well, that would sink us, because we rent a Methodist chapel, and they meet before us. So one of the challenges we face, and we'll deal with this in the risk assessment, but as probably when we start, we'll only have one service. So in my mind, that would be the morning, but actually it may make more sense to go evening, so that we can actually make sure it's cleaned between services. So, and we're their guests, although we're a much larger church. We're their guests. We're paying guests, so we have to work with them. Work with them, and they're good hosts, really. So that's okay.
All right, so that brings us to Josh, who is actually doing something different. There's some. I'm assuming there's some jealousy, some holy jealousy from many folks. Sanctified jealousy. There we go.
Yeah,
in terms of what you guys are doing. Go ahead.
I think we've got actually a great story in that, the Torch Center, which is the community center we meet in. I can't speak highly enough of either the board or the man who kind of administrates it. They have gone out of their way. We're the only ones of their users who wanted to begin using it as of the 5th. And they have gone out of their way to make preparations for us. And I'm really thankful, because it's meant people who are basically on furlough are doing work to prepare the building for us. And they allowed us to kind of come in, have the building a little bit longer. So I set up on Saturday night, because I knew that it was going to take forever to do the first time setup, trying to figure out where everything was. So they allowed us to come in Saturday evening this past week to do all the setup and leave it overnight. And they sent, I got an email from the head of the board on Monday morning, making sure that everything was okay and it all worked well. And so we did meet. We do have the main hall there at the community center is large enough that we do have enough room to spread out. We only had between a third and half of our congregation back on Sunday morning for worship. And then we're continuing to live stream because they've got Wi-Fi. So we're able to do that from the building. And so we're having a worship service. We are singing, a little bit less singing than we would normally have, but we're singing. And yeah, it went well this Sunday. And I will say, more than I could have imagined after a very busy and kind of difficult week, just gathering with God's people again and just having a Sunday with some fellowship took away so much of the, I hadn't slept well. I mean, so much of the emotional exhaustion and things. It was such a blessing. Praise the Lord for the fellowship he gives us. Yeah. And I think that there is the very real possibility that something we could learn through this as we begin to meet is just, maybe we're not aware of some of the benefits we lost as we stopped meeting. Some of them we are. Some of what we lost we realize. But when we start getting it again, we're going to say, wow, I mean, my mental health is better for time with a few believers on a Sunday. It's amazing how helpful it is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing we should do another podcast at some point, because, a lot of stuff's coming out in regards to these lockdowns and the mental health issues that they've raised. And certainly for ministers, that's not to say that no one else suffers. This is our job. We're ministers, so we're going to talk about that. But it is something to be said. Like our whole job was just, we had to adapt incredibly quickly to a medium where we're barely able to kind of work through, and then not have any physical meeting and contact with our people, and now start preaching to computer screens. And so, I fully can believe that there's a stress level reducing to physically meeting.
I heard one guy put it like this, that for some ministers, they've gone through a bereavement. They've actually they feel like they've lost their congregation. Now, I think on one hand, that's overstating the case, but on the other hand, I'm very sympathetic to it, because we all respond differently, don't we? And for some people, not being able to meet in person has felt similar to a bereavement, that they haven't seen their flock. I know we haven't met in person yet for worship, but just pastorally, with the restrictions being lifted, being able to just go for walks with people, hang out in their gardens, go and have a cup of tea, just see people in person. It's just like, this is amazing.
Even go into their houses now. I mean, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I will say, Michael, I think because we're ministers, we're aware of the effect on the ministers ourselves. One of the things that's just been so clear to me, and it's grown the last few weeks as we're thinking about this, is, or Andy, even the bereavement picture you used, our members, I mean, the church members, those who are Christians, they're having the same struggles. It has affected marriages. It's affected families. It's true everywhere, but especially in the church, I think I've seen this. And our people are, many of them are missing these things just as much as we have. And if there's something then keeping them from being able to enter fully into the return as we return, whether it's a caution or whether it's from, some people, there's some restrictions still there that they struggle to worship with or whatever it is, that's not easy for them. And we're going to talk more about the way we consider others later on, but it is important that, I think as hard as it's been for me as a minister to not be with my congregation, I honestly think it's been just as hard for most of my members of my congregation not to be with one another. I think that I could run the risk of seeming like it was worse for me when actually it wasn't. It's just been been just as bad for all of us.
No, and I think the point that I was driving at is certainly the need to be praying for your minister during these transitions, both what has happened with lockdown and online ministry to coming out of lockdown, because certainly I think that what congregants, I guess, may not see behind the scenes is that we're trying to be peacemakers. We're trying to deal with disparate sides. We're trying to deal with government regulations. Like, again, it's not that we're suffering more. It's just there's a huge amount of work involved with reopening and getting back. And so there's a sense where really praying for your minister and encouraging your minister and realizing that it's a tough line to walk, and something we'll get to at a later part. And sort of that's what I was drawing at. But I think yours is a good
stuff
corrective.
we're bad at as well. So suddenly,
is there anything we're good at?
Well, stuff that we do regularly, then practice that. So you just feel that So we started with a very limited. Right back when we did that first podcast about what are we doing in lockdown, and here at CPC we're just doing a Periscope me to the phone because that's all my broadband could cope with. And then we upgraded and we started doing a bit more, and that was great. And then we decided to upgrade my package again, and I won't say the name of the company, but it rhymes with ET. And so they cut off my old provider, but didn't give me anything. And I rang them and said, I've got nothing. And like, hey dude, where's my internet? And they said, yeah, we'll sort that out on the 26th of July. So when we all go back, and so I'm now running off a hotspot. So if I disappear from the podcast, you know where I've gone. It's not, I'm being rude.
It's not the rapture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, we don't have to rewrite the confession. So
it's fair. Yeah.
So that kind of thing is all the stuff we're not very good at, and then something comes along that makes it a little bit harder, like taking away your internet, and
right,
challenging.
Yeah, I think as well, I something else just to feed off what you were talking about there, Michael. There's a whole smorgasbord of responses, aren't there, to this lockdown? And there's, on the one hand, there's kind of paranoia for our health, and there are some people are just completely freaked out, worried about their health, and they're going to get the disease. There are other people who should be, because they do have underlying problems and they really do need to shield. And catching COVID-19 would at best hospitalize them, and it could be a lot worse. Then you've got people that are kind of like very blasé about this and like, who cares? Then you've got people who the conspiracy theorists, who are kind of like, the government's against us, they don't want the churches to meet. So you've got this whole, and I'm not saying any of these are right or wrong,
right?
But as ministers, we've got all of these positions represented in our churches, and we're there trying to go, okay, how do we love each other? How do we not get embroiled in the political debate, in the scandal, in the conspiracy theory? How do we love those that are shielding? How do we protect those that are concerned? How do we respect those that feel their human rights are being infringed, et cetera, et cetera? There are those that have got a saying, look, the worship of the church in person is the priority, and everything must sacrifice to that. How do we hold these things together? And it is not easy, is it? It's a nightmare.
No, and this is the thing, when you begin thinking about that, there's so many complicating factors. So we went back this past Sunday, the 5th, and so did our sister church nearby, who sent us out, who kind of planted us several years ago. well, they have their own building. So they were able to put out instructions for exactly what that would look like a week and a half in advance. Well, we didn't even know if our building was going to be open a week and a half in advance. When they did finally let us know they were going to be open for us, they gave us instructions on how to use the building 20 minutes before I was supposed to be telling my congregation what our instructions would look like.
Wow.
And then there were, so here I'm giving 4 days before we're actually going to finally have worship again, I'm finally telling them what it's going to look like with some question marks still in place. And I at least have had a lot of conversations about this, and they've not had time to process what is really difficult for them and is hard for them to consider. They didn't know about restrictions they would have, and it all of a sudden surprised them. And that's not, I mean, it's not fair, but it wasn't something I was doing intentionally. It was the reality of the circumstances. It makes it very hard. And then decisions we're making in terms of caution can look like we're making decisions for political reasons, when in actuality, we're making the same decision, but we're making it, the law that I'm concerned about is the law of God, not the law of, and I can be making it from a very different decision, but it can look like a political decision when it's not. And, so thinking about all of those things can be very, very hard when there's so many complicating factors. Even if we want to assume the best of one another, it's so hard to do that when, 2 different people making the same decision or 4 different people making the same decision are making it from different reasons. And that's just a very big reality, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's jump on that. Or sorry, Darren, I'm cutting you off.
Oh, no, it's probably where you were going anyway. But I just think there's a couple of guys here who are very casual about the whole COVID-19 thing, and I'm saying that as some way of showing them off, because they think there's no risk. We should be singing "Just Chill Out, guys." But so I'm not going to name them. But they're saying, but the love issue is a no-brainer. So put your face mask on. We don't do very much to start with. As everyone feels more confidence, as the numbers go down, we start introducing more stuff. So for them, although they'd be happy if I said no social distancing, no mask, and we're going to sing 8 hymns, they'd go, yeah. But it's not about them. So they're quite happy to have restrictions because they know that other people will be coming along in drips and drabs as their confidence grows. So,
but I will say, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, if we're going to place restrictions or changes to worship, whether that's mitigations or social distancing or whatever else, and I think we will all have some of these things in our worship as we return. If we're going to do this, we need to be able to, as elders, make a strong case that it is in obedience to God's law that we are doing these things. Because if we're actually imposing things on people and it's not in obedience to God's law, our confession makes very clear that we can't impose things on the conscience unless it comes from the Word of God. And so we need to be able to make a biblical case according to God's law for everything we're doing in worship. We need to be able to tell people this is what the Bible says and this is why I'm making this decision. Otherwise, we could very easily run into imposing things on people's consciences with regard to worship that don't have something to do with God's law.
Although what I would say alongside that is Michael wrote a little thing last week about on the specifics about just being patient as we go back. And right at the very beginning, when we didn't know what coming back would look like, I wrote a little thing about bearing with each other, because all these sort of electronic communication and cross wires.
Yeah.
And there's a very helpful thing in the larger catechism that I mentioned about bearing false witness. And it's not just about telling porkies, it's about even not telling the truth unseasonably, and also about not attributing things. And so that's what we're asking people to do for us and what we want to do to them. So if someone says, look, I really think we should sing without face masks, to not go, well, that's because you're unloving and reckless.
Yeah.
To not jump to that conclusion. And same as someone says, well, I'm going to stay at home for another week. And you say, well, that's because you fear man more than God. Don't jump. It might be true, but don't jump to any conclusions about why somebody is saying what they are or the course. There's a lot more you need to ask of somebody. And so we're asking for people to be patient with us whilst we make mistakes, and we need to be patient with them. And actually, how to do that? Well, I wrote a little blog about it, but actually the confession's pretty helpful about that. And all that's doing is drawing cross sections across the Bible. about how we treat each other.
I think it's really helpful to be able to step back. And again, I'm often saying this, isn't it wonderful to be reformed? Because we get categories, we get hills we should die on, and hills we don't need to die on when you approach things through the Reformed faith. So as what have our forebears said? What does the Reformed faith say on worship? Well, it clearly delineates that there's a difference between the circumstances of worship and the elements of worship. So we're regulative principle guys. We believe we only do in worship what the Bible says. But what the Bible says, it doesn't say, you meet at this time, wearing these things, doing these. No, it gives us the elements of worship. It doesn't even give us an order of service. Okay, it gives us what should be in worship. So, singing is an element of worship, praying is an element of worship, preaching is an element of worship, so on and so forth. But we clearly distinguish between elements and circumstances. Circumstances being everything else. So the time, the place, a lot to do with the details of worship are circumstances of worship, and they're up for grabs. Basically, they will be culturally dependent. They'll be dependent on different churches. They'll be dependent on different eldership, and so. We need to just remember this, that we don't need to die on the hill of circumstances of worship. Right. Any other thoughts along those lines, guys? Or a question I've got is, any biblical principles we can use to approach this thorny issue of returning to worship?
Well, I was thinking we've discussed this a bit, where you speak of singing as an element of worship. Should we not have singing in a service? That doesn't mean it's no longer a worship service. Right. It's not something we want to be normal, but I think we can see it when we say not every service has a baptism in it. Not every service has the Lord's Supper. I'm actually in favor of weekly Lord's Supper services, but
Lord's services definitely. Yeah,
Lord's services. I'm in favor of that as well. But just because we don't have the Lord's Supper in a service doesn't mean it's not a worship service. And so right. I think that's what you're trying to get at, is that as we look at this, we want to be singing. I love singing. We should be singing. But if we're not singing, that doesn't mean it's not a worship service. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't sing. That's just saying, again, this idea of charity, which I think is what we're trying to drive at as well. And Josh was trying to drive at in terms of binding us to the Word of God, but not over binding us.
Yeah.
Also thinking, this might be a bit underdeveloped, so forbearance if I pronounce a heresy. But if you...
No charity for you.
Okay. Yeah.
We will think the worst.
Once we can gather, there'll be a big stockpile of wood. And but no, thinking about some other, along the lines of what Michael was saying, thinking of the exile, thinking of some of the situations in the New Testament where certain circumstances are mitigating against doing it quite as you want. And so in the exile, they're away from the temple. Sometimes they're meeting by rivers, things like that. So there are things that you would want in a worship service that are not quite in place yet. So you think of missionaries and some of the missionary context around the world, that their service is not quite how we would do it, not quite how they want it, because of the circumstances that you're in at the moment, and it's temporary. And so we're beginning to. And I was thinking about what would I preach on, and looking at Ezra too, about how they came back from exile. And you think of how dramatic it was when God consecrated the temple at the time of Solomon, and how disappointing it is at Ezra that there wasn't a grand reopening with a big banner and Zerubbabel clips the thing and they all go back and it's wonderful. It's a real disappointment that the young people are cheering because this is fulfillment of God's promises, which it is, and the old people and the Levites are weeping because it's not like it was. And the fact the exiles came back in drips and drabs, and I don't want to over-egg it, but there are some parallels, aren't there, between us and the exiles? So we've been away from the temple, God's body, the temple, and now we're returning in drips and drabs. In the first week, people are in face masks and not singing, or only singing one hymn or whatever it is. And it's going to be it's a wonderful to return, but a damp squib at the same time. Mm-hmm. There are some parallels there, and that might help us thinking through some of the things Andy was saying as well about what you need for it to be a church service.
Well, and there's some other things that we can do that are, so you mentioned circumstances and things like that, Andy. One of the things we did on Sunday, because we had less songs, we had songs and singing, but we had less than normal. We did a responsive reading from the Psalms. We used our Psalter actually in doing that in the service. So we were still using the Psalter we would normally use every week. So it was the metrical Psalm. But, you know, there's several Psalms that are clearly written for responsive readings. I mean, you can see that, or responsive singing one way or another, however you do it. So we're actually using something that's biblical in a biblical way. And actually, I think it's maybe something we should do more often. We don't often enough use Psalm 136 in a responsive way, even though Psalm 136 is very clearly responsive. And so it was actually a helpful thing. It was something that we got to do that was different, that was biblical, that we don't normally do. And so it provided, even the circumstances provide us an opportunity to do something slightly different, but something that is not just a good idea, but is actually biblical.
I think as well, I know this, I'm going to state the obvious now, but we need to love each other and bear with each other. And I remember a sermon by Edward Donnelly. I think it may have been at the Banner of Truth Ministers Conference, but I've heard him on many other occasions, so it may not have been. Don't quote me on that. But you know, he said, when we often pray, don't we? Lord, make me more loving, make me more like Jesus. And he kind of, in his own inimical way, said, now, how's God going to answer that prayer? Is he going to bring into your life this 20-something, suave, sophisticated, conversational, easygoing, likable chap or lady who is just, you know, you get on with like a house on fire? Is that how he's going to make you more loving? No. He's going to bring someone into your life who's difficult, who's tough, who's got personal hygiene issues, who struggles to make conversation, who disagrees with you politically, etc., etc. Now, you want to grow in love? He'll throw something at you that's going to be really hard. And in a sense, I think that applies here, doesn't it? As a church, this is our moment. No, it's always our moment. I don't want to over-egg it, but this is a great opportunity as a church to love each other, to say, you know what, I disagree with you. I disagree with you. You know, like you said, Darren, about these two young lads who are kind of like, they don't see what the fuss is, but they've said, I'll wear a mask. That's okay. Oh, we'll sing less. That's okay. You know why? Because they're loving. That is the Christian response. And this is the test, isn't it? The test is how are we responding to this with our brothers and sisters? And too often in the history of the Christian church, what we've done is at the moment of pressure, we started stabbing each other in the backs. And I would make an appeal to God's people right now. Of course, if your church or your elders are asking you to break God's law, you stand up against them. But I don't think anyone is asking you to do that. We're asking you to exercise love. And it's hard. I know. That's how you become more loving.
So I agree with you, Andy. Let's tease this out a little bit more as we're talking about this, though. We live in a time where they say, well, you get to love who you want in the way you want, and I get to love who I want in the way I want. I mean, that's what our society says. So let's talk a little bit, though, about what are some tangible, I'm not thinking in terms of actual decisions we're making at the church, but in terms of attitudes, in terms of approaches, in terms of thought processes, how do we love as Christians? When we say that, what do we mean? I think there's several principles we can lay out about how we love as Christians. But I'm interested.
I think going back to Darren's point of charity in disagreement, I would say that I feel like that's the starting point. Like that's the bare minimum, is that we give charity to those we're disagreeing with, because that's to me that the problem is we've got two sides. That's what the article I wrote. We've got two sides that both have merit, and they're shooting at each other, and instead of renouncing our rights as Christians. So I think first step is charity in our debates. Think the best of your brothers and sisters who disagree with you fundamentally, to the point that they could fundamentally put you in a difficult situation, whether that's mask, no mask, singing, no singing. Think the best of them first. And if we start there, again, I'm starting, the very top, but I feel like that's the place to start. And then we start working out from there.
Believe it or not, I think that's excellent. I'd also, there's another starting point, and that is realizing and appreciating that love is very, very important. It's interesting, isn't it, that in the great chapter on love in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, the first 3 verses is the Apostle Paul trying to persuade us that love is the most important thing. If I speak in the tongues of angels but have not love, I'm a clanging cymbal. If I offer up my body in the fire for Christ, if I'm a Daniel, he's referring back to Daniel there. If I'm like Daniel but I don't have love, you haven't got it. And I make that point because I have had ministers in the Reformed Church openly mock me for emphasizing love. What are you, some sort of big girl's blouse? No, I'm biblical. That's what. And it's because we don't appreciate love. We have sacrificed we've sacrificed love on the altar of truth. Now, don't get me wrong, we mustn't sacrifice truth on the altar of love either. There's a tension. We believe in one holy apostolic Catholic Church, and those are in tension. The unity and the holiness are in tension. The apostolicity and the Catholicity are in tension. I get that. But if we don't appreciate that love matters, the way we do something is as important as what we do, then we're like a clanging cymbal. And then go on.
No, that chapter is wonderful anyway, and but the context of the book. So we read 1 Corinthians 13 out of context, and we go, "Oh, how sweet!" When you read it, and imagine the first readers, you get to chapter 13, you go, "Ouch!"
Yes,
it's because of what happened in the earlier chapters, and I think you could perhaps there's too much license, but adding to that list from 1 Corinthians, if I have doctrine but not love, I'm a flapping dictionary or something. I'm just words. I'm just.
Yeah, and it's the same case that John makes in 1 John 2, 1 John 3, 1 John 4, 1 John 5. The number one evidence, how do you know whether you're saved? What is the confidence? What is the thing that gives you confidence? Do you believe that the man Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, first of all? So it's belief. And how do you know whether you believe the man Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? Do you love one another and love God? That's the obedience is loving one another and loving God.
I was thinking that just before you said it, that the John's letters is the connection between truth and love. So if someone has got good doctrine and is unloving, I would question whether they really believe their doctrine that they're espousing.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And that's the logic of 1 John 4, and it's very powerful. Don't tell me, I'm going to paraphrase, don't tell me you love God, who you can't see, when you can't love your brother and sister who you can
see.
And he says, it's strong. You're a liar.
The message, Andy Young's translation.
And John says twice. John says twice in the New Testament, in 1 John 1:18, or not in 1 John, excuse me, in John 1:18, and in 1 John 4:8 or 10, I can't remember. He says twice, no one has ever seen God. And in John 1:18, he says, no one has ever seen God, but the man Jesus Christ revealed him to us.
Yeah.
And then in 1 John 4, he says, no one has ever seen God, but when you love one another, God abides in you.
Yeah.
So where do we see God? Where is he made present? In Jesus Christ, the revelation of the Father, and in our love for one another, the revelation of the Father. These are the two revelations of God.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I was just going to go back to 1 Corinthians 13 because those verses.
So was I. There we go.
Verse 4 to 7. Love is patient. Having prioritized the importance of love in the first 3 verses, he then goes on to say, well, what is love? How does it show itself? It's patient, it's kind, it doesn't envy or boast, but then it says it does not insist on its own way.
That was going to be my point, is that you think of the Christian love, which what we've been talking about, the love that we're supposed to have towards others. Obviously that's then grounded. Why don't we make 3 starting points, right? It's grounded in Christ, right? And what do we see in the life of Christ, in his love, is that his love, what is it, Philippians 2? Like, it's this giving and giving and giving and giving. It's the washing of the disciples' feet. It's the renouncing all of his rights. The one good man, and we killed him. Yeah. And that's the method and the model. And as disciples, we're to follow after that, where he renounced everything in order to show love. I mean, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his son. And if we can't model that same love, again, I think that's what John's probably getting at. And Paul's dealing with this heavily and highly dysfunctional church that is just, they're a bunch of jerks to each other. And not just the sin, but just the, I've got tongues and I follow Peter and I follow Paul. And it's just this incredibly dysfunctional church. And Paul's solution to that is shut it, sacrifice, and love each other. You bunch of nitwits. That's my paraphrase. Go ahead, Josh.
I think the Greek has that semantic range.
Yeah, it does. It does have that semantic range.
Yeah,
there'll be blog posts on GRUK website on it in the coming months.
So the GRUK translation of the Bible. No,
I think in loving one another, though, I think stepping back. So I think this is helpful in terms of thinking what love is, the importance of love, where the example of love is, things like this. When it comes down to where the rubber meets the road with me, the way that I love people is the way that I think about them, the way that I speak about them, and the way that I act towards them. I mean, those are the way with anything, a thought, word, and deed, kind of
head, heart, hands.
Those are, and so if thought, word, and deed is the way that I act out my Christianity and my love and everything else, then I need to think with regard to the various categories in my life, how I love them, because I'm called to obey and love various categories in my life. So with my fellow church members, I must not think poorly of them because they are in Christ. These are the ones for whom God shed his blood, to use the language of Paul in Acts 20:28. I don't get to think badly of them because I'm thinking badly of Christ if I think badly of my fellow believer. I don't get to speak of them in a way that brings them down or that causes anybody else to think badly of them. I don't get to tell stories that leads other people to think badly of them. If I know, I mean, this is a ridiculous example, but if I know, so-and-so doesn't like blonde hair, then I ought not to tell somebody. I mean, of course, this is completely facetious, but don't tell them somebody who I know doesn't like something, don't tell them this thing about this person. I'm to build them up, not to tear them down. Third, so that's with the membership. And then I ought to not do things that even come across, perception is reality, that come across as unloving. And then it's not just my fellow believers, with those authorities that I've been given, whether they're civil or church authorities. God has placed authorities over us, and we don't get to question them in our minds or think of them in our minds in a way that is unloving, because we're to love the authorities God has placed over us because they are Christ to us. The civil authorities, Paul says, are God's ministers for our good, and the under shepherds are Christ shepherding of us in the elders in the church. And so we don't get to think or speak to others in a way that brings down the elders that Christ has given to his church or the authorities. The language in Ephesians, honor the king, it's the same word that he uses when he says honor your father and mother. Would you want your children thinking of, speaking of, or acting towards you in this way? Would that be dishonoring? Then you better not do it to the authority placed over you. And I think we've got to actually guard what we say when we meet our friends in the park and we're all talking about the thing that's going on today and thinking about, everything, the announcement the government has just made, or, what we have or haven't heard from our church leaders, and how do we speak about them to others? How do we think about them in that conversation? Are we building people up or are we tearing them down? Because our fellow believers and even the authorities who are not believers are Christ to us in some sense, is what the scriptures teach us. And so we dishonor Christ when we dishonor those that God has put us in relationship with through Christ. And so it's not just a matter of what do I think of so-and-so, my fellow believer, but actually what do I think of Christ? And John makes that case in 1 John so clearly, is that our love actually communicates how we our love for one another communicates how we think about Christ. You were pointing out that in John 4 there just a moment ago, Andy, that how do you know whether you love God who you cannot see? It's whether you love your brother that you can see. And this is the situation that we're in. And so we have to be very comprehensive in this. And where do we have the most trouble doing these things? When we're under the greatest stress, when we're under the most emotional difficulty. It's the time when we need to guard our thoughts and our minds the most. Is when we have the greatest difficulty.
I think that was really helpful, Josh. I think just really practical, thought, word, deed. That's very, very helpful. Extending on from that as well, we're going to fail, and that's okay. Yeah. Another way we love each other is by forgiving each other. Some of us are stressed. Some of our people are stressed. Some of us, this has done unusual things. Michael, you've mentioned the effect mentally it is having on people, and just in terms of low moods and that sort of thing. Our fellow believers, dare I say, even some ministers, we're going to say things, we're going to think things, we're going to do things we shouldn't, that are unloving. You know what? In the gospel, we have the cross, we have forgiveness, and one way in which we love each other is by being quick to forgive, and understanding and bearing with one another through all of this.
How many times should we forgive? 7 times 77.
Exactly.
Great. Now I have to forgive.
Because I know my members and my family and my wife, I'm probably going to need those 70 times 7 of forgivenesses. And I think every one of us will in this.
It often strikes me in Ephesians where he talks about this, all the sort of spiritual, what God's trying to do in making this this one new man out of Jew and Gentile, and he goes on about spiritual warfare. But where spiritual war, it all sounds very Frank Peretti, if you remember any of that sort of stuff from the 80s. Perhaps you were guided towards better books, but
no idea what you're talking about.
Okay,
I know exactly what you're talking about, Darren.
Google it afterwards.
Andy and Michael, it's because you're so young. It's because you're children. Darren and I remember these things.
Yeah, it's because you're so. I won't get anyone. But often spiritual warfare people think of in these sort of like these novels, like this is not what Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or people like that thought, but Frank Peretti tried to make it in sort of today's terms. So the idea that angels having a big punch up, you pray and they sort of pump their muscles up and things like this. And but actually, we're in Ephesians, we're spiritual warfare at home, especially in church. So it's when we rub up against each other, that's where the devil attacks. He doesn't send a literal flaming arrow at you. He sends a thought, a temptation, and a really irritating person who's got a bee in their bonnet about something, and you have to love them and be kind. And that's being the person with a bee in the bonnet might be me some weeks. And that's the spiritual warfare, and that's where we need to put on the spiritual armor, and that's where we need to exercise the fruit of the Spirit. And so on.
I think that's really helpful, Darren. And just sitting there just for a moment, it has struck step back from Ephesians 5 and 6, and just worth doing. Just look at the flow of Paul's thought there. He says, "Don't be drunk with wine; be filled with the Spirit." You have 4 participles where he's talking about the church gathered. What we should do: we should be singing, we should be encouraging, we should be admonishing, we should be submitting to one another. Then he talks about husbands and wives. Then he talks about families. Then he talks about basically masters and servants, or bosses and employees. Then he talks about put on the armor of God, because of the spiritual warfare. So that's exactly what you're saying, Darren.
And then he talks about outreach.
Then he talks
that's the interesting bit. The difference between Colossians and Ephesians is the outreach bit. So in Colossians it all flows down, and Paul in Ephesians sticks in this bit about the armor of God.
Yes.
But even before the bit we're talking about, there's lots about just relating in the church, in the family, in the public realm. Is all of this is the battlefield is relationships.
It's exactly bullseye. That is it, and that's what the devil tries to get at. That's why Paul is saying, be careful in these areas, because the devil's very happy if we tick our doctrinal boxes and then hate each other.
Right. It's the stereotype of churches splitting over the color of the carpet. Yeah. It's like Ian Hamilton always says, more splits happen because of culture than because of doctrine.
Yes.
And then you just look for a doctrine to hang on it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. To excuse it.
Yeah. Right. Well, we could keep, as in typical GRUK fashion, we could keep waxing till the proverbial cows come home, or some other Englishism that I don't know. Porky's never heard that one. Something about a woman's blouse that Andy said.
Where have you been?
Look, I'm an American.
I was called a big girl's blouse.
Oh no, that can
a pansy, a wuss, a loser.
I know what it means. I'm just saying I've never heard it. But well, let's just really quick. Where do we go from here? When we've talked about how to love, I think certainly it's prayer. It's being conformed to the image of Christ. And I think we've been getting at this, is that if you want to love one another, it cost Jesus his life. Right? It's not going to be easy going forward. But again, the world's watching. What are we going to do with it? And we're going to be responsible for our thoughts and our words to him.
And it's just one more step on the process. I mean, quite honestly, we're doing this podcast and stuff and treating it like it's a big deal because lockdown's ending or whatever else. But the reality is, it's one more day in the church. It's been 2,000 years, and there's going to be trial every day. And we'll make mistakes today, and tomorrow we wake up and we think, as we're reading our Bibles, I made a mistake and I need to confess and apologize and then seek to be godly once more. And we won't make any mistake today, or none of our members will, or none of our fellow presbyters will, or whatever else it is that, hasn't been made before, that's not common to man, that we get to apologize for and move on and grow and change.
Well,
I would just say, I think we should rejoice. We met online last Sunday. We're going to be meeting online for another 2, 3, 4 Sundays. And with the church, I led our church in prayer, thanking God that, Josh, you were meeting, that other churches were beginning to meet. I know we're limping back. I know we're third to half full, etc., etc. But let's just rejoice. I know I'm
Exactly.
an irrepressible optimist, but let's just be thankful and give thanks to God with our brothers, whether we're meeting back or not, in conditions that we like or not. Let's just give thanks to God, and I think that's a good way forward.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been good chatting. I think we can't stop. I mean, I think we can't do any better than rejoice in the Lord for his kindness towards us in meetings. So I think on that note, I need a gavel to just say, all right, meeting podcast adjourned. Yeah.
Yes.
So thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Great stuff,
thank you,
guys. Praying for you all.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
That's right.